I think for me at least, when I read through those comments, or sorry, the I think it was five, reasons and responses. I think probably the most divisive one would be regarding or maybe divisive is not the right word, but the most at least significant argument would be the abortion component of that. Um,
Right. Yep.
and I have an article from Nebraska Medicine that was, that just sort of had asked the question you asked, we answered, is the title of it. Do the COVID-19 vaccines contain aborted fetal cells? And I thought they did a really good sort of nuance with regards to mentioning that, both Pfizer and Moderna don't have it, but they used aborted fetal cells in confirmation tests. And so, to some extent, I think your answer focused on the part about, the shot themselves don't have aborted fetal cells. But then there's still a component of the development that would be utilizing, let's say, that technology, or utilizing some of those, I think, derivatives from those cells is probably a better way of using it. So I wonder if you could speak to it a bit, as well as, where you would fall on that, and what you would tell people who are just, thinking about that issue.
Right. And you're certainly right to say that this is one of the reasons that I think is most or most means the most to some
Mhm.
Christian groups, I would say, and is probably something that Christians care about perhaps more than some other people groups, and perhaps even some other faiths. And so it is true. And like you said, there is a lot of nuance. And so perhaps I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about this because there's so many pieces to understand, I think.
Mhm.
And so, indeed, many years ago, scientists derived some cells from at least two elective abortions. And some of those cells are from the lung. I believe some of the other ones were from a kidney, perhaps. And there are brief papers published about the origin of those cell lines, but it's important to know that they're not new or in any way fresh fetal cells, but those cells were then used and passaged in the lab to create what we call a cell line. And a cell line is just a petri dish full of cells that grows a lot better than any cells directly from a body would do in the lab. And so having a cell line that grows really well is incredibly helpful for producing things like viruses and producing some other things in the lab, proteins and whatnot, because it can do so really efficiently. And so that is why those cell lines were developed in the first place. We are not developing cell lines that way anymore. But I try to argue in my paper that even if you think that development was wrong in the past, perhaps we can consider if there's some way to use those for good moving forward. And so we're not doing those processes anymore. Should we just leave those cell lines in a freezer somewhere and not touch them ever again? Or could we actually consider ways that they can actually contribute positively to understanding health and development and disease? And I certainly would lean towards the latter. I think the way that I understand redemption spiritually, and redemption in everyday life, is that good can come from bad, as long as we stop doing that bad or do our best to stop doing that bad. And so that is my approach to some of these really hot and really contentious ethical topics in science and faith. And I don't mean to dismiss it in any way. It is so significant, and there's so many components to take into consideration. But when I look at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, I know that the production of those vaccines didn't make use of any cell lines derived from aborted fetal tissues. Yes, some of their other testing, some of their confirmation testing did. And I suppose some of those confirmation tests did contribute to the success of those vaccines indirectly. But in my mind, it's a very loose connection, and it's something that I think we can keep talking about. For some other vaccines, like the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, they make use of cell lines derived from aborted fetal tissues more directly. And so perhaps for some people, like, because we have a choice of what vaccine we receive nowadays, especially we have several approved, I think you can look at those options and see some that have a more direct tie to cell lines derived from aborted fetal tissues and those that have an indirect tie. And we could probably spend all day on that topic.
Yeah.
It's significant.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think about the passage in Romans 14, 13 to 23, where it talks about like, don't be a stumbling block to your brother. And as it relates to conscience, right? He's making the argument between the stronger Christian, the weaker Christian, and essentially, um, and if any listeners are listening and I'm getting this wrong, please let me know. but being a stumbling block is to your brother is telling your brother to do something that he doesn't feel like he can do, meat offered to idols or whatever the case may be, like the example.
Go against
traditionally, pardon?
Go against their conscience.
Go against their conscience, right? So being a stumbling block to your brother is trying to get them to do something that they don't feel comfortable doing. And then that's where we see in Romans 14:23, and it says, but whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. For whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. And so the point I'm making is that it still comes back to a person's conscience, and not being a stumbling block to your brother to force him to do something, him or her to do something they don't feel comfortable doing. But to your point, about the process and how the vaccine's being made, I think from a Christian perspective, I'm thinking, it's funny, I'm using this term and we're talking about this, the genetic fallacy. Right, so we're talking about genetics and vaccines, but the genetic fallacy argues, just error in logic, which argues that just because something has a bad origin, doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad outcome. So we don't necessarily, as Christians, we don't necessarily judge things on the origin, but of the outcome. Romans 14:14, because nothing is evil in and of itself. Kind of like the point you just made, Rebecca, about like the vaccine may have some questionable ways how it's been put together, but ultimately it's serving a purpose, to help people. And if they feel, if they feel their conscience and it's in good faith, then they go and do that, and that's up to them.
Yeah, I think that's some great things to add. And I would also just kind of comment a little bit on the talk of kind of going against your conscience, or how you feel personally about a decision that you make. And certainly, I know for myself and a lot of the other scientists and health professionals that I talk to and that I work with now or have worked with in the past, like, none of us wish ill on the general population. We all want each other to be happy and healthy. And for so many people like myself that have worked with vaccines and that really understands the immunology, the science of the immune system, we know that vaccines can help. And so we wouldn't want anyone to feel bad about receiving a vaccine. And so hopefully, if anyone really is struggling with that, then perhaps they can reach out to people, their family doctor or other healthcare professionals or scientists, to just talk about it. Maybe they'll change their mind, maybe they won't, but at least you're trying to work through those feelings and kind of make more sense of them. I know some people just feel uncomfortable with vaccines, especially these vaccines in this pandemic, because they were made in record time. And a lot of people are worried about the safety of these new vaccines because some of them were made with newer messenger or mRNA technologies. And as someone who has seen science progress over time and seen, maybe to go back to the example of genetics, the fact that we're sequencing genomes faster than we ever have for less money than we ever have, I just see progress being made everywhere. And I think the progress we're making in vaccine development is no different. Of course, we're going to make vaccines faster than we ever have because there's more scientists now than we ever have. And there's certainly more need for vaccines now than we've had in past years where there's been no pandemic. And the messenger RNA technology is not that new. It's been around for many years. And now finally we have a new pathogen where this technology can really be used well. And I'm really excited, in particular, for these new mRNA vaccines, just because they're so simple and sophisticated. I just get really excited about how we can use that technology to combat other infectious diseases and perhaps other non-infectious diseases that are still plaguing people in Canada and people around the world. I think there's a lot of good they can do.
Please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date. If you liked or disliked the snippet, give it a like and share your 2 cents with us in the comment section. And remember, 6 cents makes change.